Hello, everyone. I'm Mabel Chan. Welcome to my podcast, One in a Billion. Today, we continue our fall season Find Your Roots special series with a spotlight on Asians in New England. Find Your Roots is about Asian American mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, looking back at the roots of their family history, cultural identity, and personal journey, one person at a time.
My name is Emily Chah, and in Chinese, my name is Tsai Mei-er.
Many people know Emily Chah as the Tiger Mom after her controversial parenting memoir, The Battle Hymn of a Tiger Mother. Amy belongs to the boomer generation with her cultural roots in Fujian, China.
I was born horribly in 1962 in Champaign, Illinois. I identify as Chinese American, a proud American, but also really proud of my Chinese heritage.
Amy moved around a lot in her childhood, and the idea of home is a bit elusive.
I live in New Haven, Connecticut now, and it's honestly pretty far from what I consider my roots. I don't really consider it home in a deep way. My parents still live in Berkeley, California, so that's a kind of a home for me.
Emily Chah, a Yale Law School professor and the New York Times bestselling author, just released her debut novel, The Golden Gate. In this episode, Amy reflects on her early childhood, the formative influences from her parents and grandparents. She also talks about her parents' immigration journey to America. What made it hard for them? And what was tough for her? Now, at this stage of her life, what is important for her to pass on to the next generation? Here's a conversation. When I Googled you, Emily Chah, I got close to 7 million hits and
Oh my God.
more. Next to your name is also known as quote unquote Tiger Mom, then American corporate lawyer, legal scholar, writer, and of course, you've been a law school professor at Yale for over 22 years, specializing in foreign policy, globalization, and ethnic conflict. So, I'm curious, among all these different roles and labels associated with you, which one are you most proud of and why?
You know, I don't know about the tiger part, but I think the mom part, my two daughters are the most important thing to me and the most important thing I've ever worked on and done. So I think the mom part, I'll embrace, I'll just own it. Probably being an author is what I'd next identify with, certainly not corporate lawyer.
I see. That's cool. I got to be honest, when your 2011 memoir, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, came out, I was back at Harvard, not as a student anymore, but as a visiting scholar. Your book caused a stir on campus. Like every Asian student I know knows about it, and reactions were fast and varied. Like, yeah, me too. I have a tiger mom. Or no, not me, thank God. What's your reaction to those reactions?
Yes, it was incredibly intense. I thought the book, Mabel, was just going to be a funny memoir. I had no idea it was going to create this global firestorm. I think partly it was unusually honest. I just thought that everybody would get the humor and the tongue-in-cheek part. So I've been thinking about this a lot. The reason it was so personal for everybody is not everybody has a child, but everyone has a parent. And for a lot of people with strict tiger parents, whether Asian or not, it wasn't a good experience. So for a lot of those people, it was almost traumatizing to kind of hear somebody, seemingly boasting about it. I understood for the first time what my mother might have been thinking when she raised me that way.
Wow. I could only imagine because to this day, like you just said, I mean, it's just impossible to be disassociated with this AKA Tiger Mom.
I know. I just was stopped in the street. It's been 11 years. A young woman just stopped me and asked me if I was the tiger mom. I couldn't believe it.
How did you respond? What did you say?
I actually said, "You're kidding. You still know what that is?"
Well, then, on a more serious note, Amy, what's the difference you wanted your story to make?
It was more like a diary. The backstory is I was just fighting with my rebellious daughter. And I thought, you know what? I'm just going to write all this down. So the process of writing the book was very different than my process for writing all of my other nonfiction books, which, I spent a lot of time doing research and kind of excruciating care, formulating each sentence. This just kind of poured out like this big flood of emotions.
And that's what the public responded to, and that is very natural and spontaneous. But, as you were writing, if I remember correctly, you once told my former ABC News colleague, Juju Chang, that you didn't anticipate the intensity of some of the reaction. You intended it more, not as a how-to, right? But you're
Oh, absolutely
intending that
not.
more like a parenting memoir and your own transformational journey as a mother. So, my question for you, Amy, is how would you describe that transformation?
I think that I was extremely overconfident as a parent, which is also good. A lot of my Western friends are filled with, oh, should I do this? Should I do that? But it's autobiographical. I'm the eldest daughter of four daughters. And my parents were super strict with me, but it really worked. Like they're 86 and I'm still incredibly close to them. So I kind of felt like, you know what? I know how to do this. And basically what I tried to do is raise my own two children the same way that my parents raised me. And I would say that the big dramatic lesson was I realized I could not do that. I could not replicate the immigrant experience because my parents were immigrants who came here with nothing, and I was not an immigrant. I was a different generation. I was born here. My kids had a lot more privilege. I couldn't just replicate it. And at the same time, I also learned that you just can't change children that much. You just cannot change your children's personalities that much. My two daughters are basically exactly the same way they were when they came out. Sophia's my oldest daughter, and she is just your classic rule-abiding, hardworking, calm oldest kid. And then 3 years later came Lulu, who was literally kicking even when I was pregnant with her. And she came out, and I just feel like, it was my comeuppance. I mean, she had colic for like 3 years. She wouldn't roll over. She wouldn't do any of the basic markers. A lot of people thought she had issues. And she just basically said no to every single thing.
Oh, wow.
So that was a challenge parenting her.
Wow, I can only imagine. I'm not a mother, but I did a lot of parenting stories when I was at ABC with Juju Chang. Your experience is very fascinating to me. I feel as if I'm a surrogate mother to a lot of younger people. So I'm always fascinated by parenthood. I want to know, how has motherhood changed you, though, Amy? Priority, your sense of self.
I would say it's mostly a humbling experience. I'm very stubborn and I tend to be very goal oriented. I put my mind to something and I usually get it done. And I think that served me well. But it was both a challenge and a trauma and an honor to encounter two very, very strong-willed daughters. My oldest child, she once said to me much later, she said, everybody thinks that I'm the easy kid, but they just don't know that I chose to listen. I chose to go along with what you said. As they've gotten older, I'm proud of the fact that if something goes wrong, they come to me immediately. And I think that in a way is the more valuable part of parenting.
You must have a hope or a dream or expectation that you want a certain aspect of your parenting philosophy to be a takeaway for your readers, right? What may that takeaway be that you wanted?
Look, I made a lot of mistakes, but I think the biggest takeaway is honestly that true self-esteem, true inner strength has to be earned. I really do believe that genuine, deeply rooted confidence has to be earned by the child by overcoming a challenge or experiencing a rejection or a failure. And instead of giving up, just kind of learning to say, look, I'm going to apply myself. I'm going to try again. And then ultimately finding a way to overcome that challenge. I think that's what instills real inner strength. I see that a lot in my students, the ones that are too fragile. They're brilliant, but they're too fragile to cope with anything. They get one piece of criticism and they're devastated.
You're shattered.
Yes, they're and not all Asians, but I do see a lot of immigrants' kids who tell me that they were raised somewhat similarly with parents who were a little bit tough on them, who held them to high standards, who didn't just compliment them all the time. And I find often that those are the kids that have resilience. They have grit. Look, we all get depressed. I hate criticism.
Yeah, it's human.
But the ability to kind of just pick yourself up off the floor after one bad day, one bad week, one bad month, and then just say, I'm going to keep going. That's really important.
Right. Well, you have once described very powerfully and succinctly how you're shaped by your parents. You said this, and I quote, I was shaped by all the contradictions in and creative chaos of my extended family. My mother is very traditional, raised a strict Catholic and determined to instill in my sisters and me the Confucian values of filial piety, hard work, and respect for authority. At the same time, my father was a rebel in every way, the black sheep in his family, extremely skeptical of all religion and authority, and the first to come to America. So, my question is, Amy, when and how did you decide what parts of your mother and your father's values you wanted to emulate, and what parts didn't you want to emulate?
Yeah, it was confusing because my mother was saying one thing, authority, never talk back. Meanwhile, my father was born for America. I mean, he just saw himself as like Davy Crockett. He wanted to try everything, fishing, skiing. He taught me how to use a chainsaw.
Wow. And that was in the Midwest where you grew up.
Yeah, it was the Midwest. He once told me, Amy, you should invent your own field. That way it'll be all yours. You won't have to deal with competition. He was always telling me to think outside the box.
Right.
And my mom was always like, keep your head down. Don't be too loud. Follow all the rules. So I feel like I was always more naturally like my father. When I was really little, I often felt that my mother just disapproved of me. And it was really hard. But when I was adult, I realized how lucky I am to have these diametrically opposite parents. I actually think it's a gift that my dad is so untraditional Asian. That's something that a lot of people, if they read Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother carefully, they see that in a funny way, I'm actually kind of idolizing rebels, right? Because Lulu is a rebel. She's kind of the star of the book. I write with a very rebellious voice, even though I'm talking about being a strict parent. And my dad, who is the hero, I reveal at the end, was a huge rebel. So I think I'm very lucky to be the product of this kind of crazy mishmash of styles, the best of East and West, almost.
Now, you also described your grandparents this way. You said your grandmother on your maternal side was a devout Buddhist with bound feet and serene personality who believed in reincarnation. And your grandmother on your dad's side was Protestant, modern, and a huge, loud personality, matriarch of the family with a talent for making money. So, my question is, when you observed your grandmother's spiritual beliefs and practices, what moved you?
It was so bizarre because every single member of my family was different. So I would watch my grandmother doing Buddhist prayer circles. In Indiana, she came to live with us for about 3 years and very serene. She had a heart problem, so a very soft voice, tiny feet. And, she wouldn't step on ants. And I kind of loved that beauty and serenity in her. But my mother in the Philippines had been converted to Catholicism. I think she thought there was something wrong with it. Meanwhile, my dad was this proud atheist. Like he was always whispering to me, these Bible stories, they're just fairy tales. So I didn't know what to make of that. And then I have my grandmother on my father's side that in many ways I think was the most powerful and interesting person in my entire family. She was clearly a genius, even though she was not allowed to go to school. She was the youngest of 9 children, the only girl.
Wow.
Even though she had to just kind of sit at home, she eventually ended up running my parents' family business. From China, all the men came over in the 1900s and they started this fish paste business that was okay. But they made fish paste and the containers And it was after the Second World War that my grandmother was the one who said, you know what? Forget the fish paste. Let's just make the containers.
Wow.
And that company ended up becoming one of the largest plastics conglomerates in the Philippines.
Wow. While she saw something, she had a vision.
She had a vision. She just was this fireball, stereotypical dragon lady, actually. She put my grandfather in the basement and she had this whole upper floor that was sweet to herself. She was a character.
Well, I was just wondering, listening to you talking so colorfully about different characters, women in particular, the grandmothers on both sides, I wonder again, when you were watching them, did you ever ask, what did you want to be in terms of your own spirituality?
I don't think I was introspective enough as a little girl. I was this overconfident oldest child. And I was raised Catholic myself. When I was very little, I just wanted to kind of achieve and excel to make my parents proud. So I say it with regret. My husband, who's Jewish, is so philosophical. And from when they were little, they would debate great religions and foreign policy. But I was raised in a way not to ask all the big questions. To be really honest, I don't think I was very reflective spiritually as a little girl.
You were much more performance oriented
I
and
think so.
achieving driven. I
Yes.
totally get that. I want to talk to you now about your parents' immigrant journey to America. Okay. When did they come to the United States and why?
My parents came in 1960. It's an interesting story. My mother did not want to come. They were both overseas Chinese in the Philippines. Their parents had come from China, Fujian province. And they grew up in Chinese communities, speaking Chinese. They're part of this, what I coin in my book, World on Fire, this market dominant minority community, a tiny minority of 1% in the Philippines that is very insular in some ways and also very entrepreneurial. So my mother wanted to just stay there and be a doctor, and she loved her family and she had lots of friends. But my father was the middle child, a twin, and the black sheep in his family. And he just did not want to go into the family business. He was a dreamer. He loved philosophy and astronomy, math, physics type of person. And he actually persuaded my mother to elope to the United States.
I like it.
But they didn't elope in the most romantic way. They applied to MIT. He applied for them and they got fellowships. So they basically eloped to MIT, which is not the most
intellectual elopement.
I know. It's not the most exotic, beautiful elopement. But they came to Boston in 1960. And the first year they were here, they were so poor, living off only graduate school stipends that they couldn't afford heat. Their first 2 winters in Boston, actually. And they had to wear blankets around all day to stay warm.
Wow. Did you know about your parents' struggle as an immigrant? How difficult was it for you to watch when you were a child?
Well, when I gained consciousness, I was 3 years old and we were already in West Lafayette, Indiana. I would say that the struggle that my parents went through, I kind of pieced it together. My mother was incredibly homesick. My dad had actually promised her that they were going to go back to Asia, but he just ended up becoming a professor at Purdue when his career took off. And like so many women, my mother gave up her career. She was a chemical engineer with a degree from MIT. But she had 4 kids and my father, his English improved very quickly because he was teaching. My mother stuck at home. She was the one taking care of us. She made us practice writing Chinese characters every day. I had to write letters to my grandparents. So I kind of pieced together that my dad was very happy in America because he didn't miss his family at all, being the rebel.
It suited him.
Yes, it suited him. It suited his personality. But my mother was very homesick and she had tons of friends back in the Philippines and all of her family back there. It was harder for her to make friends. So I saw that very poignantly. And she wanted to bring her parents over, and that was a struggle because they didn't fit. They created a tiny Chinese grocery store in West Lafayette, Indiana, so that they would have something to do, and they came and lived with us. but it didn't do well. They were school teachers, not entrepreneurs. So I saw that immigrant struggle. It's
A sense of alienation for your mother in particular.
yes, and feeling like she had let her parents down and feeling a responsibility for taking care of them, and they were so miserable here.
How were you affected, Amy, at that stage when you're that young? Was it traumatic for you to witness, to talk about?
It was not traumatic, but it was confusing, and I learned to keep my mouth shut at the right times. I would sometimes hear my parents arguing because my grandparents were very traditional and my dad was very adventurous. He's like, oh, we're going to Chicago this weekend. We're going to the World's Fair, or we're going to Chinatown. And my mother would want to take care of her parents. But for me, it was more like being very perceptive and slightly changing my personality depending on whether I was talking to my grandmother, my grandfather, my mom, or my dad.
I can see it as you were talking visually, what it might have been like for your mother back then and your father as well in that environment. How about the external challenges in terms of perception of who they were as Asian in that environment in the Midwest?
Oh, it was incredible. People can't imagine it now because there are so many Asians in this country now,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
we were the only Asians in our entire neighborhood. We stuck out like a sore thumb. I was the only Asian American, maybe in the whole school in West Lafayette,
Oh,
Indiana. We had the funny haircuts. My mother cut my hair herself, just straight across these bangs. I had a very strong Chinese accent growing up. I had to bring a Chinese lunch to school. My mom would always make fried rice or leftovers. All I wanted is like a sandwich. I think that my attitude has always been more like my father's. I remember seeing people make fun of him. At first, I just felt so embarrassed and humiliated for him that he doesn't even know they're making fun of him. As I got older, I slowly realized he just didn't care. Once I told him about it,
he ignored them.
and he also said, this country is so much better than the one I came from. So that was kind of his attitude. But for my mother, it was definitely a struggle. She always felt like an outsider. She would say to me, I can't talk. They think I'm an idiot. Nobody thinks I'm funny because she says I can't be funny in my second language.
Right. You hit on language, right? In what ways were the struggle as immigrants back then the same or different for you and for your children? When you talk about language, that in and of itself is so empowering when you're able to master that and just run with it. That must have been a lot easier for you and your children than their times.
Oh, completely. I still remember. So my parents had a very different attitude. My dad threw me into nursery school at age 3, not speaking a word of English. My first language was Hokkien Chinese,
Oh,
and I was also learning Mandarin through my mother. And at home, they enforced Chinese very strictly. For every English word I later accidentally said, I got one whack of the chopsticks. So they wanted to make sure that I was fluent in my home language. But when I got to nursery school, I couldn't speak a word, but I learned very, very quickly. And I remember a story so vividly in 4th grade. This is now in California. A boy named Jeremy made fun of me for mispronouncing the word restaurant. I pronounced it restaurant.
oh.
He made these slanty eyes and he started running around the whole playground saying, oh, restaurant, restaurant. I was so upset. And I remember going home and telling my mom was like, why do you care about that stupid boy? Like she wasn't comforting. She was like, we come from the oldest civilization. We have 5,000 years of history. We invented everything. If that stupid boy doesn't even know that, just forget about it. Who cares if you have this Chinese accent? But what I did is from that day, this is strange. I vowed to get rid of my Chinese accent. I don't know how I did it, but I just concentrated. I don't think I have a Chinese accent anymore, but I did.
Well, especially when you were growing up with 2 languages and also a dialect, it was almost impossible not to. So you did very well. You're determined.
And my daughters were so different because, of course, I forced them to be bilingual. In a way, their dad is Jewish, so
Yes.
their first language was naturally English. Just as soon as they were born, I made sure that we had Chinese nannies. It was really important to me that they maintain their Chinese connection.
Amy, how tough or not was it for your parents to accept a non-Chinese as your husband?
It was very tough. When I was 4, my father said to me, you will marry a non-Chinese over my dead body.
Ooh.
I will never forget it. My dad now denies saying that. It's really funny. I realize back then he was so scary. My dad was like 30 when he said that. That's so young.
You ignore him, basically.
Right. But when I finally met my current husband, Jed, and I realized that, oh my God, this might be the one, my mother was so upset. I'd let everybody down. I remember she said to me, do you realize, Amy, if you do this, your kids might have curly hair? And I was like, Mom, you perm your hair. We all perm our hair. This is in the 80s. But as soon as they met him, this is the best story ever. They fell in love with him.
What did he do to win them over? I want to hear about that.
Actually, this is a crazy story. For the first time she met him, my mom made this like 12-course Chinese dinner. Every single dish was pork or shrimp. She said, I see that you're eating all the pork and shrimp dishes. And my husband was very patient. He said, oh, yes, Jews are very different. There are some Jews keep restrictions. My family never has. And at one point she says, I see that you're not wearing one of those little hats on your head.
Oh.
Yes. And again, he was very patient. He explained, and you are not going to believe this. Swear to God, Mabel. At one point, my mother then said, she's looking all confused and suspicious. And she actually says, but you do admit that you killed Christ, right?
Wow.
Yes. And I thought, oh my God, this is going to be a disaster. But instead, my husband laughed and he said, I did not kill Christ, but it was my dad. My dad did it. He told a joke and then my mother was confused. And then my husband actually explained that, did you know that Jesus Christ was actually Jewish at the time and that the Last Supper was a Passover? So that was his approach to kind of just fill the cultural gaps and just kind of explain the history. And that's kind of the way he is as a professor. He'll just like explain things.
He is great at handling what appears to be tense moments, but he's good at resolving conflicts. Your family, you're Chinese, and he's Jewish. How do you negotiate in terms of identity with your children? How do you resolve any conflict, or how do you come to agreement?
It was a constant struggle. I think that I was pretty lucky. My husband, his parents were very, very lax. They had no rules. They were like 60s hippies. They're lovely people. They were brilliant, but they split up. And so he was on board with my more strict parenting. I was very confident. He did have a strong view. He was very, very committed to our kids identifying as Jewish. So we kind of struck a deal where they would be Jewish and learn. I didn't convert, so technically they weren't Jewish, but he would always tell them about Jewish history. We celebrated the holidays. And I found my niche through language. It was very important for me that they learn the language, learn to write the language, learn about Chinese history, and spend a lot of time with my parents. So my kids could eat anything. For Chinese people, as you know, eating Chinese food is like a huge part of their lives.
Well, I wanted to go back now to some stories that you have written about what your parents went through back in the war days, the harrowing childhood, living through the Japanese occupation. That was what your mother told you. And you pass on the stories she told to your children. Is there a reason that you wanted to do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And maybe a lot of parents these days would not tell these stories to their young kids. So my mother and father lived through Japanese occupation in the Philippines. It was a brutal period. A lot of people were killed. My father did not have very strong memories, but my mother lost a baby brother to this. One of her uncles was tortured to death. She saw people bayoneted. It was brutal for her. So she told me these stories. When she first came to the United States, she wouldn't buy Japanese products. So it was very much part of my own upbringing, hearing these stories. A lot of parenting has changed. And I'm not so sure the new way's better. Right now, it's like, oh, don't traumatize your kids. Don't tell them. But my parents told me everything. And I repeated all these stories to my kids. I wanted my kids to have the whole legacy. You may be growing up in a comfortable home now, but this is where you come from. There's been struggle at every level, and don't take anything for granted. You should feel lucky because my parents went through Japanese occupation with barely any food for 3 years. So I part of not wanting them to be too spoiled and to realize how privileged they are, I felt it was important for me to give them the larger family history.
Do you remember your reaction as a child listening to your mother telling these stories? And then how did your daughters react?
I am really from a different generation. And even in my teaching now at Yale Law School, I have to really change my approach because people are just much more fragile. A lot of the stories that I was told, I don't think I would repeat to my students, my 26-year-old students, because it's almost like trigger warning or this could be traumatic. There were many, many rapes. My mother didn't go into it, but she said, when I was little, they dressed me like a boy because what the Japanese did, we didn't talk about specifics, but I kind of figured it out. So there was no filter, no screening. It was pretty total brutal honesty from my parents. And I, for better, for worse, did the same thing with my kids. And again, I don't mean this as a how-to for everyone, but in some ways, I feel like if you do it right and show that you do love your children, you're not saying it just to horrify them. I think that children could take a lot more than you'd expect.
Well, let's think about your parents' influence on you.
My mother is very oversensitive. So she feels bad when she thinks people disapprove of her or she said something that didn't come out quite right. And I have it. Maybe a lot of women have it. There could be like 99 things that go well in a day and one thing that goes badly. And I just dwell on that because you just feel stressed and beat yourself up all the time. And I definitely got that from my mother. But it could also be good. It makes you perceptive. You also do want to be empathetic and,
you want to be better next time.
Yes. And also sensitive to how you're making other people feel. So my father just doesn't have that. He's oblivious. And sometimes I wish I got that part from him. He just shakes off failure. I think it's from being this black sheep. Like he has this funny quality to him, even now at 86. So from my father, I think I got a daringness. I love trying things. I love huge parties. I'm very gregarious. I have a very loud voice. And my mother chides me for that. She thinks I'm too loud.
Your parents left China for the Philippines. China would be the roots of their culture. Have you ever tried to trace your roots in China? Have you been to China?
Oh, yes, many times. I was always told that my roots are in China. And we've been to my ancestor's tomb in Fujian province. I actually have a family heirloom in my living room that goes back to the Ming Dynasty. I have a very important heirloom, actually. It's like a huge book, 18 inches by like 15 inches.
Wow.
And it's a manuscript that my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, whose last name was also Cai, he was the imperial military and astrological advisor to the last Ming emperor. So a great scholar. When I was 17 in 1980, I went for the first time when China first opened up. My dad was part of an early delegation and I actually taught English. We brought my daughters there. So I am very invested in my roots in China. We know a lot about my ancestors. I've been to both my parents' hometown. We have pictures all over the house of my daughters and me, standing by my ancestors' tomb.
Well, let me ask you, since you've been to China so many times, very particular in terms of tracing your roots and also giving back by teaching, and it sounds fascinating. I wonder how each time you went back and then returned to America, what extra piece of you have you picked up and sort of pieced together again and are delighted by or surprised by?
I think the main reaction I have every time I visit China and then come back is, wow, I really don't quite fit in either place. In a good way. It's also something I've learned to not just feel sorry for myself about. I've benefited from being a perpetual outsider. When I go to China, they can tell from my accent and by what I wear that I'm an ABC, and they almost have a little bit of a sense of scorn about that. But when I come here, even with all this diversity now on my Yale Law School faculty, I'm the only Asian American woman. And I've tried to turn that sense of being an outsider into a source of strength. from my first book, where I coined this term market dominant minorities, about these outsider minorities that tend to be hated by the majority and in some ways threatened by democracy, but are very successful, to the Tiger Mom book, where in a way it's about parenting in a non-conventional way in this country as an outsider, to my latest book, this novel, The Golden Gate, is all about all the outsiders that have come to make up America. I feel like I've benefited from that perspective of just never quite fitting in.
Why is it important for you to bring your children to China, and for you and for them to know the roots of their culture?
I wrote a book called The Triple Package, and I said that very successful people who are confident and can be motivated have three qualities. And the first is what I called a superiority complex, kind of controversially, but I meant like a deep sense of pride, a sense of specialness. Because I got to tell you, it was like a shield, because I'm this little fat kid in the Midwest. Everyone's making fun of my accent. I stick out. I'm not a popular kid. And so my mother telling me, you come from a special people, we have a glorious history, kind of armed me with a kind of cultural pride that really stood me well. So I wanted my kids to have that same sense. In addition to a superiority complex, I say you need a deep sense of insecurity, because that kind of makes you feel not complacent. And the final trait is impulse control, which is self-discipline, which is something I got from my more traditional Chinese upbringing, the persistence and the perseverance. I feel very fortunate that my mom instilled that in me.
Let me close with this question. What beliefs or values that you have received from your parents or grandparents that you most want to pass on to your children?
Well, first, enormous pride in Chinese civilization. It's a terrible moment in history right now. There's a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment in this country. There's a lot of anti-American sentiment in China. It's a rough time, but I do want to always make sure that my children, and hopefully later descendants, have a link to 5,000 years of history. And also, I think I'm very proud that my parents taught me never to give up. I've been a very controversial figure. I've been the center of many firestorms and scandals. And it's that same quality that my parents instilled in me, which is just keep going. Don't give up. You have that inner strength. Live another day, push through.
That's right. Live another day, push through, keep going. Thank you, Amy.
I did everything I can as a mother for you, but don't feel that you have the burden to have to give everything back to me. You are released.
That is Mai Du, a Vietnamese Chinese-American mother and a martial arts teacher, Kung Fu master. That's what she told her son on his high school graduation day. What does it mean to release her son? What does freedom mean to Mai when she was just 8 years old and landed in America with her family as refugees from Vietnam? Tune into that episode on November 21st, the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. One in a Billion Find Your Roots special series is made possible in part by a generous grant from the Phi Lambda Charitable Trust. We also rely on listeners like you to sustain our production. Please consider supporting our work with a donation. To donate, just go to our website at www.oneinaBillionVoices.org. Click Donate. Your donation is tax deductible. One in a Billion is produced by our sound engineer and designer Brian Latwinowicz, and our lovely theme song is composed by Brad McCarthy.